When Monty claimed only one man could run the war, this cost him authority. It's a sentence that sounds like hard military logic, until you remember it was spoken inside a fragile coalition, where pride, politics, and national prestige were as real as tanks and artillery. The winter of 1944 had turned northwestern Europe into a grinding kill zone of mud, ice, and shattered towns. In the wake of the German Ardennes Offensive, what the Americans would call the Battle of the Bulge, helped keep these stories alive. Subscribe to World War II Frontlines and stand guard over the history they fought for. Allied commanders were trying to hold the line and rebuild momentum. And at the center of the storm stood Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery, commander of the Anglo-Canadian 21st Army Group, Britain's most famous living general, and a man whose confidence could inspire entire armies or ignite entire headquarters. By late December 1944, Montgomery was not merely fighting the Germans. He was fighting for influence over the Allied war machine itself, arguing that the Western Front needed a single dominant commander to direct all ground operations. Little did he know that what he said, and how he said it, would damage his standing with the Supreme Commander, enrage his American counterparts, and cost him authority at the very moment the Allies were closing in on Germany. Bernard Montgomery's reputation had been built the hard way through meticulous preparation, strict discipline, and a conviction that a commander's first duty was to avoid unnecessary slaughter. His victory at the Second Battle of El Alamein in November 1942 made him a national symbol of British resurgence. And by 1944, he carried not just a marshal's baton but the weight of British expectations. Yet the alliance that carried the Western war forward was changing. By 1943–44, American manpower and industrial scale had become dominant, while Britain's army faced limits in replacements and overall strength, meaning British leaders wanted victories, but at a sustainable cost. That reality shaped Montgomery's operational personality: deliberate, heavily planned, and often suspicious of bold improvisation. When planning for D-Day, Montgomery's organizational energy and insistence on simplicity helped shape Allied ground preparations, and he initially commanded Allied ground forces until General Dwight D. Eisenhower took direct control. But friction was always close. Montgomery's brusque confidence and public self-assurance repeatedly irritated American generals, and his relationships with senior Allied airmen also grew tense as arguments over credit and operational priorities intensified. Then came September 1944, Operation Market Garden, Montgomery's great gamble to seize a Rhine crossing near Arnhem and open a route into Germany. The operation failed and inflicted heavy casualties, damaging his reputation and sharpening Allied doubts about his judgment. Still, Montgomery remained vital. He commanded the 21st Army Group, held the northern shoulder of the Allied front, and would soon face the most dangerous German counterstroke in the West. December 1944. The weather turned vicious: low cloud, winter fog, and bitter cold that cut through uniforms and stiffened fingers around rifle stocks. For soldiers in slit trenches and ruined villages, the war became a contest against exposure as much as enemy fire. And in that weather, Germany launched its last great offensive in the West. The Ardennes attack slammed into American lines, creating chaos and fear across the Allied rear areas. Communications failed, units became separated, and commanders were forced to make rapid decisions with imperfect information. The Supreme Headquarters had to stabilize the front, fast, before the Germans could exploit surprise and weather to break through. Eisenhower's job as Supreme Commander was not simply tactical. It was coalition warfare at the highest level, aligning national forces under one strategic vision. At moments of crisis, command boundaries could change, and temporary arrangements could be made to restore coherence. In that environment, Montgomery's role became highly visible. His forces, positioned in the northern sector, were well placed to help form a defensive shoulder as the battle raged. But here's where personalities and power collided. Montgomery had long believed that Eisenhower's broad front approach lacked the concentration needed for a decisive blow, preferring instead a narrower, coordinated thrust where one commander could direct the main effort. And in the fraught politics of 1944-45, the question of who commands whom was never just military, it was national pride, prestige, and legitimacy. By this stage of the war, Montgomery and Britain's senior leadership had repeatedly argued that Eisenhower needed a land forces commander to coordinate the army groups. They persisted with this idea into early 1945, even as it increasingly annoyed American leadership, especially as U.S. strength grew while Britain's field arm began to shrink. Even if the Americans had accepted such a coordinator, the political reality was obvious. It would almost certainly not have been British, and it would certainly not have been Montgomery. Yet Monty kept pushing. And when the Bulge crisis set nerves on edge, the pressure cooker was primed. Exhausted staffs, wounded egos, and the terrifying awareness that missteps could prolong the war or cost tens of thousands more lives. By 1400 hours on one winter day after another, staff cars churned along icy roads between headquarters, dispatch riders carried urgent messages, and radio sets crackled with fractured reports. Maps became confessionals, pinpricks of units, arrows of uncertainty, and red lines that could collapse at any moment. In that atmosphere, Montgomery was not content to simply fight his sector. He wanted a fundamental change in how the entire Allied ground war was run. What happened next would become legendary, not because it was a firefight, but because it exposed how close the Allied command structure could come to rupture, even in victory's shadow. A coalition war is a balancing act. Every commander must weigh not only operational efficiency, but also the trust that keeps allies fighting as one. And Montgomery, brilliant, admired by soldiers and famously certain of his own judgment, too often treated that trust like an afterthought. After the Bulge began to stabilize, Montgomery's public comments and private insistence on restructuring Allied command inflamed American resentment. He rather overdid his self-praise, in the words of one account, by suggesting in a press conference that he alone had saved the Americans, deepening an already bitter relationship with U.S. senior officers. The damage was serious enough that Montgomery was ultimately obliged to write an apology to Eisenhower to restore British-American relations. This was not an isolated pattern. Montgomery's arrogance was frequently noted, especially by American officers, and even Churchill's famous line captured the problem: indomitable in retreat, invincible in advance, insufferable in victory. By the time the Allies were preparing their final drive into Germany, patience with Montgomery's political pressure tactics was thinning fast. The crisis was not just about tone, it was about authority. Montgomery's continued arguments for a ground commander above Army group level were, to American leaders, a direct challenge to Eisenhower's Supreme Command. In a coalition where the United States was now the dominant military partner, British demands for overarching control looked increasingly unrealistic. Fear gripped the men, not only those in foxholes, but also those in headquarters who understood what a broken command relationship could mean. A fractured alliance could slow offensives, complicate logistics, and hand Germany time it did not deserve. And in the background was an ugly truth. Montgomery was still essential on the battlefield, but his behavior threatened the unity that made victory possible. By the end of 1944 and into early 1945, Montgomery's fading star became a subject spoken about more openly. His armies continued to fight hard in attrition battles and clear approaches to the Rhine, but the political weight behind him was no longer what it had been in 1942. The alliance had evolved, and Montgomery had not evolved with it. In war, there are moments when a commander must know not only when to attack, but when to stop talking. Montgomery did not stop. The turning point wasn't a single shot fired or a bridge seized. It was the alliance reasserting its hierarchy. Eisenhower understood that sacking Montgomery outright was politically dangerous, given Montgomery's stature with the British public and the support he retained from key British leadership. But Eisenhower also recognized that the war could not be run by competing egos, especially not by a field marshal who could not accept the finality of reduced authority after September 1944. So the solution became clear in practice, even if never shouted in a single dramatic order. Montgomery would be contained. He would command what he was assigned, his army group, and the strategic direction would remain in Eisenhower's hands. The coalition would not be reorganized to satisfy one man's theory of command, no matter how polished his arguments sounded in a staff conference. Montgomery's battlefield usefulness remained real. He continued to lead the 21st Army Group effectively in the final campaigns, and his armies would cross the Rhine in Operation Plunder, described as the last of his colossal cracks. But the broader influence he craved, the idea that only one man should run the ground war, implicitly pointing to himself, did not become his to claim. And perhaps the deepest irony is this: Montgomery truly believed his methods saved lives. Many soldiers admired him because they believed he would not waste them, shaped by memories of earlier wars and generals who seemed careless with human cost. But coalition command demanded more than careful tactics. It demanded humility, restraint, and an instinct for shared credit. What happened next would become legendary in the quieter way history sometimes records, not as a heroic last stand, but as a lesson in how authority can be lost without a formal demotion, through words, ego, and the slow closing of doors in rooms where decisions are made. Montgomery finished the war with real achievements still intact. His forces helped liberate territory in Northwest Europe, and he oversaw the German surrender in the Northwest, later commanding the British Army of Occupation from May 1945. Yet by war's end, his political capital inside the Allied command structure was diminished, and much of the tension stemmed not from what he did, but what he said, especially after Arnhem and after the Bulge. The historical significance lies in the coalition lesson. As American strength grew and British resources tightened, the alliance's center of gravity shifted, and Montgomery's inability to adapt to that reality made him, increasingly, a difficult partner at the top level. He remained a national hero, but in the machinery of Allied command, his authority was narrowed to what the coalition could tolerate. Montgomery's post-war path reflected both honor and controversy. He received a life peerage in January 1946 and later wrote memoirs that damaged relationships and reputation further because of their one-sided tone. Even in later life, beneath the public confidence, he carried the private weight of the lives lost under his command, acknowledging the moral burden of decisions that sent men into fire. Montgomery's story is not only about battles and plans, It is about how words can cost a commander the very influence he believes he deserves. It's a reminder that in coalition warfare, victory depends as much on unity as it does on brilliance, and that ego, unchecked, can become a strategic liability. This was just one of countless untold stories from the Second World War. Subscribe to World War II Frontlines as we continue to bring these forgotten chapters of history back to life.